Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Machine & Krieger MaK SF3D, whatever you want to call it. Maybe Robot Battle V for those who are really into it. Yeah, all right. Thanks for coming. And I gotta say, first off, there's a lot of MaK entries on that table this year. And as someone who has been bringing MaK for like 5 years, and like the first 3 years was literally people going, "What is that?" It's really great to see how much it's grown. And how many people here in this have built a MaK or like know what it is roughly? Okay, cool. Well, it's never too late to start because it's in a really good place right now. So I'll go through a few slides and then we'll kind of just open it up for a Q&A. So Machine & Krieger, what exactly is it? I mean, it's a line of plastic models, duh. I mean, that's why we're here. So what's cool about it is that there's no anime, no manga, no sort of like a typical media you would associate with the kind of like Gunpla anime sci-fi modeling genre. There is, in 2017, they announced there was going to be a Hollywood movie based on it. But we all know what happens when Hollywood takes a franchise that we like and does a big budget movie. So I'm excited to see it, but my expectations are not like huge because controversial opinion, but I hated Villeneuve Dune. So there was a short like straight to VHS promotional video they made in the 80s. It was made by Subaraya, the people who make Ultraman. I think you can get the whole thing on YouTube. It's kind of like a stop motion, like a short like special effects showcase kind of video. So that being said, there is a story to Machine & Krieger. It's essentially, I guess you could say like Mad Max, Blade Runner-ish kind of. There's World War IV, not World War III, so there's 2 more World Wars. The Earth is completely jacked up. People go live on these colony planets. They come back, they resettle the Earth. And then there's, as these things go, some more wars break out. And now they're doing it with these very cool looking powered armors. And the only way to really get the story so far is on the actual model boxes. You can see right there on the model boxes, there's that text on the side, and they just have little blurbs, and that's really like the bulk of the story. Because, like I said, there's no real sort of overarching narrative. And one thing that I really, really like about Machine & Krieger is that it's essentially the work of like one guy. Gundam, it's a huge, Bandai's a huge like, multi-million-dollar franchise. Tons of people have directed it, tons of people have written it, tons of people have designed mobile suits. That's true for a lot of like the robot franchises that we like Votoms, Macross. It's been through so many iterations. But Machine & Krieger, it's this one guy. He does everything from designing the actual robot designs, down to painting the box art, on the boxes and manuals himself, which I think is really, really admirable that he's, kind of done it himself. And all right, and who that guy is Ko Yokoyama. That is, I don't want to flex, but that is me with him in 2016. So he started out actually training as like a fine art painter. Which really plays into, I think, the kind of overall aesthetic of Machine & Krieger, because it is so kind of handmade and handcrafted. It very much, like if Gundam is very like glitzy and kind of, I guess you could say if Gundam is kind of like the Hollywood anime of Japan because it's so like this big budget franchise, the Machine Krieger is kind of like the, independent movie equivalent, to use that analogy. He's also obviously a really, really skilled sci-fi modeler. And he was originally really inspired, when he was young, by things like the Thunderbirds, the British TV show with the puppets. If you guys have seen the movie Team America World Police, it's kind of like a parody of Thunderbirds. And Thunderbirds was a show that used a lot of kind of stop motion, scale model based special effects. He was also really inspired by this painter, Shigeru Komatsuzaki, who is kind of like you could say he's like he's kind of like the sort of grand master of like sci-fi illustration in Japan. If you ever want to go down like a big Google image kind of search hole, I would just say search Shigeru Komatsuzaki. He really like kind of set the entire like aesthetic tenor of that 60s, 70s, 80s Japanese sci-fi painting style. He also was really into World War II aircraft. If you know the most iconic Machine Krieger design, the SAFs, the super armored fighting suit, the kind of like egg-shaped body, I guess he said that shape is actually based on the like elliptical wing root of a Spitfire from World War II. So I think that's really cool. And he really, really likes 60s and 70s cars, especially like race cars from then, like those kind of like old excuse me, like Porsche like 917s, where they're kind of these like blobby, kind of amorphous shapes, which you see a lot in Machine Krieger. When I met him, I asked him like, why did you pick power armor? And then, because at the time it was the 80s, so like the Gundam thing was in full swing. And he's like, yeah, I just didn't want to make the robots super big, which I thought was a really funny sort of like, you're like, oh, well, I guess that makes a ton of sense. And that, also I think plays into too the overall aesthetic where, nothing is like that high tech looking, where it's like a huge 50-foot tall robot. And it's, I think the largest design is maybe like the size of like a tank or something like that. He's done a lot of other stuff. His other credits include the original Super Nintendo 16-bit front mission game. There's a really, really great art book that has all of his scratch-built models that he designed for the front mission game, which I think is really wild to think that, someone, scratch-built like a physical model, and then the people at, was it Squaresoft, I think, made that game, like then had to like turn, a scratch-built model into like 16-bit sprites for a video game. There's a game called Carnage Heart on PlayStation that has very, very Machine Krieger-esque designs. He did a game on the Xbox called Phantom Crash that also has extremely Machine Krieger-esque kind of like small mech designs. Venus Wars, so there's like a tenuous Gundam connection there, because Venus Wars is a movie directed by the guy who drew the Origin manga, Yasuhiko, and he designed a lot of the sort of ancillary vehicles in this Venus Wars movie. Excuse me. And there's another OVA called Big Wars, which might be the most creative name, for a movie of all time. I think the whole thing is free on YouTube. It's incredible. If you like that like trashy 80s like violent nihilistic OVA anime, it's really, really good. And it's got there is a design in it that it just looks like, if you know the Noise Spotter or the Gons from Machine Krieger, it looks exactly like that. And then he also designed some of the ancillary kind of robots and vehicles in the original 1980s Bubblegum Crisis. If you guys know that, it's like a pretty popular OVA anime. And what's really cool too is that I guess to this day he's still a college art professor, so I guess Machine Krieger is like, I don't know if this is by choice because he obviously has a passion for like art and painting, but it's kind of cool to think that like Machine Krieger is still kind of like underground, I guess, enough that like the guy who's behind it still has like what you consider like a day job, but yeah, so like I would say he's got a ton of like really cool like artwork he's done for video games and stuff. If you guys like the video game series Dragon Quest, he actually did a bunch of illustrations based on that for I think a gaming magazine in Japan. And I wish I knew how to embed videos into a presentation, but he directed a ad for an energy drink with Cindy Crawford, I think, in Japan. So if you search like Ko Yokoyama energy drink ad on YouTube, I think you can find it. So let's get into the real, I guess, meat and potatoes of this, which is how Machine Krieger started. It originally wasn't even called Machine Krieger, it was called SF3D, which just means science fiction in 3 dimensions. So it was a series of articles in Hobby Japan magazine, which I'm sure you guys all know Hobby Japan. It's like the biggest magazine of this kind of interest out there, I would say. I'm pretty sure it's still being published now. So they scratch built a bunch of models, and then they made a bunch of really detailed dioramas, because I think they were really inspired at the time, by movies, like the original Mad Max and Terminator that had come out in the 80s with like really great kind of practical effects based special effects, and they wanted to do like an original one for the magazine. So there was this whole post-apocalyptic war storyline. So there was this whole post-apocalyptic war storyline. What's really interesting is, MaK, the story has been so secondary, ever since the 80s when it started, that to this day, as far as I know, there aren't even like emblems for the 2 factions, the mercenaries and the SDR. Like how in Gundam, there's like the Xeon symbol and like the Federation like cross thing. Like, as far as I know, Machine Krieger, they like never come up with even like what would like the flag of each faction be. So yeah, it ran from 83 to 86, I believe. Don't quote me on that because I can't read Japanese, but that's based on they republished these articles in like a collected edition in the 2000s, and the copyright is 83 to 86, so I would imagine that's when the original run was. And then, so back in the 80s as well, a company called Naito did a run of, I believe, like 19 or 20 kits, and branded SF3D that had, all of the designs from their sort of original scratch-built dioramas kitted out. And these kits at the time were, pretty groundbreaking, because they had, nowadays we really take things, especially with the internet, the ability to like get aftermarket stuff, we really take stuff like metal detail parts and things like that for granted. But I think these were like some of the first kits at the time for science fiction to really reach that level of like high kind of detail metal part, treating it a lot more seriously than just, here's like a decent representation of like a robot from an anime. And a company called TCI actually did import these kits into America in the 80s, which is really crazy to think that in a weird way, it was almost easier to get these SF3D kits like in the 80s in America because like brick and mortar hobby shops had them. So if you go on eBay and buy these old 80s SF3D kits, like secondhand, a lot of them still will have like a TCI import sticker on them, which is kind of like a funny, it's kind of like a weird, quirk of history, I guess. Because in the 80s, in America, nobody was even buying Gunpla, I'm sure. But you could buy, what was essentially Maschinen Krieger. And unfortunately, there was a legal dispute, I believe, between Ko and the rest of the creative team at Hobby Japan, and the series kind of went on ice for a pretty long time, I think, like almost a decade or something. Which I don't know the ins and outs of sort of Japanese copyright law, but I'm assuming something bad happened. So the SF3D kits. So you actually see on the left there, that is an English language flyer that they used in the 80s from TCI to advertise these. And some of these, it's just really crazy, like that this thing with like no movie, no anime, nothing, like had entered the US market in the 80s. And you can see, I'm sure if you like Maschinen Krieger, you'll recognize a lot of these designs as kind of being the classic designs. And as far as I know, all of those have gotten reissued by Wave or Hasegawa at some point or the other, too. And these old Naito kits, they're tons of fun because it is like a piece of model making history when you build one. They're incredibly detailed for their age. Like if you take a Naito Maschinen Krieger kit and compare it to like another kit from, let's say, like 1985, like an Imai Macross kit or like an old no-grade Gunpla, it is like night and day how detailed and like thought out the construction is. Because have any of you guys built like the old like no-grade Gunpla here? I'm sure like like those things are like insane, and they like don't really look like the design at all when they're done because the proportions are like completely jacked up. But yeah, I mean, if you this was like a really, it was kind of like the modeler's model in a way. But being 1980s engineering, they have like crazy seams. Sometimes the parts fit is like really messed up to the point where you almost have to like do the puttying seams with like epoxy rather than just like Tamiya putty. And honestly, I think some of the old Naito molds look better than like some of the newer Wave ones, just because the proportions are like a little bit more kind of squat and chunky, and kind of they're sort of more, I guess you could say, like art accurate, if that makes sense. And of course, yeah, and like I said, they all have the metal parts, like the wires, springs, and things like that. And some of them go really, really intense with that. You can see the design, the Noise Spotter, number 12. There was a variation called the Krakenvogel, and it has rocket launchers. And literally in the box, it's just like a brass tube, and you're meant to just make the rocket launchers yourself out of the brass tube. So I would say they're getting pretty expensive on the aftermarket because they are 30 years old. But if you can find a vintage Naito one that works for your budget, it's definitely worth your time to try one, because it's a really, really interesting look at kind of how sci-fi models were done back then, especially if like me coming from Gunpla, this was a really, really eye-opening experience. So the aesthetic QUIRKS that they really established at this point is, like I said, he was really into stuff like Thunderbirds and old race cars. So there's a lot of just kind of like, I don't want to say like organic, but a lot of like bulgy kind of shapes, There aren't a lot of like hard right angle kind of like armor pieces the way you see on like Gundam or something. And what's really cool is because they were scratch builds, he would use leftover decals from 148 aircraft. So you can see this World War II Finnish Air Force aircraft has that moose decal, and then it's been repurposed, on that MaK Walker on the right there. So if you're kind of like a history buff kind of guy, there's a lot of kind of like Easter egg type things like that for you. And the visual identity of Maschinen Krieger, beyond just the way the designs look too, down to things like that, like the boxes aren't like this like super glossy, typical like anime model kit boxes. They're printed on this like matte, like cardstock craft paper, giving it this really, I don't know what's a good term for it, but it's this kind of like timeless look, and then I think he used a lot of 135 and 124 World War II figures with some like re-sculpting and kit bashing for the figures. So everybody, even though it's like the year 2800 something, all the sort of characters kind of have this like very World War II or Cold War kind of look to them. Everybody kind of wears like, nobody's wearing super high tech, like, Gundam skin tight style, pilot uniforms. Everybody's like driving the suit, in like a, like coveralls and like goggles or something like that. And there, on the suits especially, there is not a lot of like handheld weapons, like typical mecha. It's what I call like the Mega Man style, where there's like a hand and then like a little laser gun arm thing on the other arm. You'll see that a lot. One thing, I wish I had brought one with me, but I totally forgot because I packed in a hurry, is all the kits have black and white instructions. And then for the paint guide and the decals, it comes with this little like file card that is kind of like written in universe, as if it's like an actual sort of like, military data readout sheet for the design. So it's just like, you can just tell like a lot of thought went into this sort of entire presentation of this thing. It's every part of it, I think, is like very evocative. If you're someone who likes both science fiction and kind of like historical reference subject kind of stuff. Okay. So the modern era begins in the late 90s. Based on my research, that model graphics cover, I believe, is the first time that there had been like a cover story for Maschinen Krieger in a model magazine since the original 80s run, and it moved from Hobby Japan to Model Graphics. They renamed it Maschinen Krieger because I believe Hobby Japan still owned the rights to the term SF3D. So, but Co got the rights to all the actual designs and like the actual, like, I guess, content of the intellectual property. And then the Kit Bash Diorama articles are relaunched in Model Graphics. And then the Naito kits actually get relaunched as well, but rebranded Maschinen Krieger. So if you look at the bottom row, that's the same mold of the same design, but with the box art of each generation. And I think this is where a lot of like new people get confused, because this really, really confused me. Because it's the exact same kit. So you can see on the far right, where it says SF3D, that's the original 1986 release of the cows. The middle is the 90s re-release of the cows. And then by the 2000s, Wave had bought the old Naito molds and then reissued them under this like Wave MaK 3Q line. So if you want a cows, that's the Naito mold. You can buy any one of those. The old one's probably gonna be the most expensive, but you get the bragging rights. You can post that on Instagram and show off. So the Naito kits are made for a good while in the mid 2000s, and again, like I said, this is all based on my research, and I don't speak Japanese, so some of this I might be off by a little bit, so I apologize. But to the best of my knowledge, Naito goes out of business in the mid-2000s. I couldn't find a reason why. So again, Machine and Krieger is not on shelves anymore. But in the meantime, this is really when a lot, because the fandom, I think, at least the fandom in Japan was so happy for it to just be back in magazines and have new content coming out. A lot of really cool resin and vinyl kits start coming out. They have this event in Japan called the Wonder Fest, where independent resin sculptors and casters can just do your own design, and you can sell your own independently made like resin small run kit for a day, even if it is. I mean, you could even make your own like Gundam resin model and get a 1 day license from Bandai to sell your like original Gundam kit that you cast yourself at Wonderfest. I've never been, but it seems like a really, really awesome event. I would love to go someday. And in the 2000s, some really, really great reference and modeling books start to get released that collect a lot of the older articles and the newer ones coming out. So you start getting these really great kind of big sort of reference books for Machine and Krieger that come out, and those are a really, really great resource just to see. If you just want really great like model making inspiration, very, very high level modeling skill in those. So the modern era continues to sort of getting into where we are now with the current state of Machine and Krieger. In 2006, Wave, who I'm sure we all know is like one of like sort of like the bigger companies in Japan doing sci-fi plastic models. They in 2006 they released the first all-new mold Machine and Krieger, the AFS Lunapon. And unlike, this is the first time they're completely new molds, so nothing is based on the old Naito, because everything up until this point was still based on the old Naito molds from the 80s. So these now have, they're like kind of like Gunpla now, where they have snap fit, they have polycap articulation. They're not quite Bandai level. I mean, I don't think anything is. They're very, but they're a lot more sort of our standards now of a sci-fi Japanese plastic model. So Wave begins making a lot of the suits. They're both making newer designs that never existed in the SF3D era, like the snake eye and all that. And then in 2009, something very cool happens. Hasegawa releases the Falk, which is that big lobster-shaped kind of fighter plane, and which is really cool because that was an SF3D design. It was in the original 80s magazine articles, but it had never gotten a kit ever, not in the 80s. So I think it got like a resin kit that was probably like very limited, but it was cool to see, something that waited like, 20 something years at that point to finally get a model made. Everybody should build one of these Falks because it's huge, great shelf presence when it's done. I think one of the truly most iconic sort of sci-fi vehicle designs of all time. I put the Falk up there with like the Viper from Battlestar or something as like an iconic kind of sci-fi vehicle. And then, since there's a steady stream from both companies, so you can probably go into most, online hobby retailers and find the Wave or Hasegawa stuff at this point. And then there's also the independent world of all the resin casters that's still going on. And a lot of the resin, in addition to full resin kits of a lot of the more obscure designs or things that are too large or complex to get a plastic kit yet, there's also a lot of really great add-ons, sort of like variant armor sets, and in being power armor, there's always like a pilot bust. So there's a lot of really, really great, very, very well sculpted resin pilot busts that they've made. and then the really big ones are Brickworks, Love Garden, Honmitz, and Rainbow Egg. And I believe all those guys do sell to North America, so you could just either do like email. I think some of it's on HLJ. And there's also Tonerico, which is a site kind of geared towards this like resin small batch Japanese sci-fi stuff. And especially if you're doing dioramas, a lot of these add-on figures and stuff are really, really great because 120, it's kind of a weird scale. You're not going to find a ton of like Tamiya or Master Box figures that are going to fit it one-to-one. So yeah, it's there's a whole kind of ecosystem of independent makers supporting the 120 Maschinen Krieger. I mean, there's everything from like a typical Maschinen Krieger like pilot figure down to like a Japanese schoolgirl like petting a cat in like 120 scale now. So, and then they're very, at least of the ones that I've done, they're really great, crisp resin sculpts with not a ton of cleanup. So even if you're like a relative like resin model kind of newbie like me, it's like not that scary to zazz up a stock Maschinen Krieger build. And then the current day, Kyoto, who you probably know either for the Revoltech toys that they did, they're really popular. And they also make a ton of those, what they call it, like Gashapon machine trading figures. So they've actually taken that and put Maschinen Krieger kits in 135 into Gashapon machines. And they're like randomized kits, but they, for 500 yen, they're like really detailed, like great plastic models. That's some on the right there, unpainted. There are some really, really well done ones on the diorama table by a certain visitor from Mexico. So yeah, go take a look at those because they might be $5 kits from a vending machine, but if you do them right, they look incredible. And obviously, due to the internet, it's very, very easy to get Maschinen Krieger now, and and based on from what I've seen, a lot of brick and mortar hobby shops are carrying it again now, and I recommend everybody support your local brick and mortar store if they carry this stuff, because Amazon doesn't need any more of your money. At least that's what I think. It's access is easier than ever for Maschinen Krieger. And even a lot of the rarer resin kits are becoming plastic kits now. If you're just patient and wait, it seems like they're really committed to doing everything in plastic eventually. And there's because of the growing English language community, there's guys like Paint on Plastic, Lincoln, who is a guy who's actually lived in Japan, and he's super knowledgeable of Maschinen Krieger, and he's got some really, really great tutorial YouTube out there that I would say, if you want to try them for the first time, his videos are a really great resource. Zaku Aurelius, the big Gundam YouTuber, he's done some videos on it. There's a wealth of information out there. If you go on YouTube now and type Maschinen Krieger, build a long tutorial or something, there's a ton of great content now. If you want to start, I would say a Wave 120 suit is the easiest place to go if you've built Gunpla, because like I said, it's polycapped joints. It has that like basic kind of HG style construction, where things kind of build around each other. I would say if you build armor or aircraft, like kind of like a traditional scale model guy, a Hasegawa kit, like a Nutcracker, or like a Stingray is a great place to start because it builds very much like armor or aircraft. I said it's like Gunpla, but you will need glue, putty, and paint probably because there are a lot of clamshell parts still, and they haven't really figured out like or if it's even possible to do like a Bandai level part separation on these things. And so if you like, obviously a kit is a great place to start, and then one of the reference books like the MaK modeling book or one of the Chronicle Encyclopedia books is really, really great, just because you can kind of like see the sort of step-by-step that all the Japanese modelers do. And from what I understand, there is going to be a English language machining figure book coming out at some point. So it's just pretty exciting. So general tips for machining figure, I would say part of really what makes the general look of machining figure is that there's this very like loose, like brushy hand paint style, and it's hand painted with lacquers. So it's almost like oil painting, where because it's a solvent-based paint, you reactivate the previous layer of paint every one you put on. You know, unlike water-based paints, where you kind of go in layers and build on top of them and glaze, you're kind of painting like a la prima, you know. And that's why a lot of the sort of like machining figure look is that super kind of like weathered, mottled, you know, like textured, the texture is in the paint itself rather than like an airbrush finish where it's, you know, meant to be this like very smooth, you know, eggshell. The Volks booth back there has some really great brushes. They're not paying me to say that, but they're really, really great brushes that stand up really well to solvent-based paints. And then also I would say, especially if you build robots and you're gonna get into machining figure, get good at painting figures. Like go on YouTube, watch some of those Warhammer guys who like, you know, can put an eyebrow on a guy who's 2 inches tall, because there are those pilot figures, because it's their power armor. And at first I was, you know, because I built basically only sci-fi robots and spaceships and things like that, I was awful at painting figures, and all my pilots looked really, really bad. You know, they looked like weird, like porcelain, creepy antique store dolls. You know, but you know, I went out there and I found some figure painting tutorials. But a well done figure, I think, can really, and not to say that I'm good now. I think I'm like just getting into like the decent zone figure painting wise. But I think that a well done figure really elevates a machining figure build, because it really shows that like power armor kind of look of everything. You know, and don't be afraid to experiment. I mean, it's a whole genre based around kit bashes and scratch building. So, and you know, the fact that there's no real like canon to anything, it's, you know, your limit is your own imagination. I mean, and some of the things that are like canonical designs, like the snowman, you know, it's very whimsical, you know. So there's a lot of room to kind of play in this. And you know, from at least from what I've seen, the machining figure community is super nice. You know, there's like almost no drama. There's everybody's just a super cool person. You know, I've made a lot of friends through MaK. It's just if you haven't tried or you're on the fence, I would say give it a try. So we're done a little bit early. Why don't we open it up to some questions and stuff, if there are any. Sure. Oh yeah, so we can go into this a little bit. The base kits for the original scratch builds. So the reason why it was 120 is because the first figure that he used was a Tamiya pit crew for Formula One, and because it was a 120 Formula One car, like this random choice of this Tamiya pit crew has locked us into 120 for the last 35 years. So I think it's a very funny, like, you know, quirk. But yeah, so the Falk, it originally was, I believe the booms are World War II fighter aircraft engine nacelles turned sideways. P-38, yeah. And then the body is a Toyota, like compact sedan. And then the engine is a yogurt drink bottle. And then there's ping pong balls on the bottom. And then the dive brakes are from like a World War II like torpedo bomber, I believe. Yeah. So yeah, it's you know, and I the cool thing is, like, once you start like thinking about things that way, I think you start to like you need to make your own kind of things like this. You go, oh well, you know, this random like arm from a Gundam can now become, you know, this or this or this. You know, it's at the end of the day, everything machining figure makes you realize at the end of the day, everything is just like a shape. You know, not to get too zen, you know, about it, but is there anything else, or good to call it? All right, well, thank you.